Picture the last wedding reception you went to. Somewhere near the end of the night, the groom scoops up the bride and carries her through the front door of a house, a hotel room, or even just a decorated archway for the photo. Everyone claps. Someone laughs that he better not drop her. Nobody stops to ask why this is even a thing people do. Why does a grown woman need to be physically lifted into her own home? It isn't practical. It isn't comfortable, and yet almost nobody questions it. That's usually a sign you're looking at a fossil, not a fashion. To find where this one comes from, you have to go back to Rome and to a writer named Plutarch. Around the 1st century, Plutarch compiled a strange little book called Roman Questions, where he asked dozens of things about everyday Roman life and then tried out different explanations for each one. One of his questions was blunt. Why don't they let the bride step over the threshold of her own home? Why do the people escorting her lift her over it instead? He offers a few possible answers, but the one he keeps returning to involves something much older and much darker than a romantic gesture. Plutarch points to the founding legend of Rome itself. According to that story, the city's earliest men lacked wives, so they invited a neighboring people, the Sabines, to a festival and then abducted their daughters by force. Roman writers openly called it the rape of the Sabine women, using the word in its older sense, meaning seizure or capture. Whether the event happened exactly as later Romans told it is impossible to confirm. Historians treat it as founding legend more than verified fact, but the Romans themselves believed something like it had shaped their culture, and marriage customs across the empire carried the memory forward, whether the memory was literal history or not. Here's where the threshold comes in. Plutarch suggests that lifting the bride reenacted that original abduction. She didn't walk into her new husband's home on her own feet because, symbolically, those first Sabine brides hadn't walked in on their own either. They were carried in against their will. So generations later, Roman brides were still being lifted over the same doorway their ancestors were once dragged across, only now as ritual instead of raw force. It's a strange thing to sit with. A tradition people now treat as sweet and old-fashioned may have started as a callback to actual kidnapping. Plutarch wasn't confident this was the only explanation, and he says so. He also floats the idea that lifting the bride showed she wasn't entering the marriage of her own free desire, or that carrying her in symbolized she could never leave under her own power either, since she hadn't arrived under it. Modern historians studying Roman marriage note the same uncertainty. There's no single surviving decree that pins the custom to one exact cause. What survives is a pattern documented across multiple Roman sources and several competing reasons for it, all pointing toward the same underlying idea: control over how and whether a woman crossed into her husband's household. The Roman explanation is only half the story, because a second, separate thread got woven into this same custom centuries later in medieval Europe. By then, most people carrying out the tradition had never read Plutarch and knew nothing about the Sabines. Instead, the doorway itself had become dangerous in a different way. Doorways and boundaries show up constantly in European folk belief as places where evil spirits like to linger, waiting for someone vulnerable to pass through. The Scottish anthropologist Sir James Fraser spent decades cataloging beliefs like this across dozens of cultures in his sprawling comparative study. The golden bough and threshold superstition appears again and again in that record. A bride, freshly married and considered especially exposed to misfortune, was exactly the kind of vulnerable person these beliefs warned about. So carrying her over the threshold kept her feet from touching the one spot where trouble was thought to be waiting. Notice what happened there. Two completely different worlds produced the same physical action for two completely different reasons. Rome carried the bride because of a memory of forced marriage. Medieval Europe carried the bride because of a fear of lingering spirits at the doorway. Neither culture necessarily knew about the other's version. Historians studying folk custom generally treat this as a case of separate traditions converging on the same gesture rather than one continuous, unbroken line of transmission. They're honest about not being able to prove a direct thread connecting ancient Rome to a medieval English village. What they can show is that the same physical act kept reappearing, attached to whatever local anxiety about marriage happened to be strongest at the time. There's also a persistent myth worth clearing away here. You'll sometimes hear that the custom exists purely because a bride was expected to look reluctant, not eager, to enter the marriage bed, and that carrying her preserved her modesty in front of onlookers. That idea shows up in a lot of popular wedding writing today. It isn't false exactly, but it's a later layer tied to Victorian-era etiquette about feminine decorum, not the original Roman or early medieval reasoning. Serious folklorists treat it as one more meaning stacked onto an already old custom, not the root of it. So, how did a Roman reenactment of abduction and a medieval fear of doorway spirits end up as a light-hearted photo moment at modern weddings? Mostly because the original reasons quietly evaporated while the action itself kept getting repeated. Nobody genuinely fears spirits crouched at their apartment door anymore. Nobody consciously thinks about the Sabines while walking into a rented Airbnb on their wedding night. But by the time those beliefs faded, the gesture had already become expected. It photographed well, it felt romantic, framed the right way. 20th century popular culture, especially film and later television, leaned into the image of a groom sweeping his bride off her feet, reinforcing it as a symbol of protective love rather than ritual control. The meaning flipped almost completely, even while the motion stayed identical. That's the part worth sitting with the next time you see it happen. The lift itself never changed. What changed was everything underneath it. A gesture that once stood in for forced capture, then for warding off evil spirits, then for feminine modesty, now stands in for nothing more sinister than affection. And that's usually how the strangest customs survive the longest. Not because anyone today believes the original reason, because the motion outlived every reason anyone ever had for doing it. So next time you're at a wedding and the groom lifts the bride through that doorway, watch the room laugh and cheer like it's the simplest thing in the world. It isn't. Somewhere underneath that doorway is a Roman legend about a bride who never got to walk in on her own, and a medieval fear of something invisible waiting exactly where her foot was about to land. The spirits are gone. The Sabines are gone. The reason, whichever one you pick, disappeared centuries ago. The lift never did.